chair recognizes Councilwoman Parker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking of unintended consequences, I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues who are members of City Council's Committee on Labor and Service for attending yesterday's hearing regarding the impact of medical marijuana on employment in Philadelphia. That would be Vice Chairman Councilman O'Neill, members Heenan, Quinones Sanchez, Taubenberger, Dom, and Gim. Mr. President, while we heard some insightful testimony from the business community, the legal community, the medical community, the labor community, and our district attorney's office, along with other city officials, it is clear that there is a host of potential unintended consequences that this legislation could have on not only employers in the city of Philadelphia, but employees. Just for the record, Mr. Speaker, I'm getting rid of it, and that's only because you told me we're going, Mr. President. Just the thought, and this is just from information and data that we gathered yesterday, that someone might not be eligible to be a caregiver. We had no idea this was an issue for their loved one because of a previous conviction is troubling. The notion that a medical marijuana patient could be fired from their job for failing a drug test is equally disturbing. In addition to that, and this comes to mind because of a recent visit to CHOP's Policy Center, its policy lab, that the notion that someone suffering from PTSD, now I know when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, many of us just think military, but now because gun violence and violence overall is also beginning to be treated as a public health crisis, we are learning that our children and families and people who have been victims of sexual assault also suffer from what is diagnosed as PTSD. So that someone suffering from PTSD or cancer or one of the other conditions, the chronic conditions that were listed, could lose their job because they are a medical marijuana patient. That was devastating. In addition to that, we learned that, let's just think about a 50-year-old who is a successful business person who has led an exemplary life for decades, that they automatically become disqualified from working in the medical marijuana industry because he or she attended a concert 30 years earlier and smoked a joint is short-sighted. In addition to that, Mr. President, I want to note for the record that I'm glad that our hearing highlighted some of those concerns and brought them to public light. I also want to note for the record that one of the things we talked about doing, and we've already began to put things in motion, was to get the private sector to work with us so that we can begin to develop a public education campaign for both employees and employers, so they not only know their rights, but they know the risk, Mr. President, because the information is, knowing the information and having it is half the battle, and we're going to work to make this happen. But it is also our hope, and we were very encouraged by the olive branches we received from the private sector, in noting that they understood our interest in seeing them, not government, but the private sector help to drive the process and lead, and hopefully come up with a set of guidelines for employees who are in the private sector. Now, relative to our own 27,000 municipal employees, we will be working, Mr. President, with our executive office, along with our council team, our council staffs, and our unions representing municipal workers, and we will be working on coming up with a rubric and a legislative prescription, if necessary and applicable, to ensure that the city of Philadelphia is a model employer, and that we do everything we can to protect municipal employees who would also happen to be medical marijuana patients. Finally, I want to just note for the record that Councilman O'Neill, I agree wholeheartedly with your sentiments, and just want to note for the record that we will submit via a formal letter and documentation to the governor, along with the legislative leadership in Harrisburg, as the state is crafting its regulations on this still evolving subject, and we will count on all of members of council to help us as we move forward in that effort, as I am often reminded of our action taken when we were working on, from a land use perspective, on the implementation of medical marijuana here in the city of Philadelphia. And we want to make sure that we just get these details right, so even whatever action we move forward with, districts and people across the city don't get negatively impacted by any unintended consequences. Thank you for your patience, Mr. President. And I also want to say, and many of you may know this lady, on another issue, I want to send a special prayer to my good friend and former member of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and that is Mike Gerber, who is an attorney and business person here in the city. But while we were here, I received a text message saying that Penny Gerber passed away. Now, while the Gerber family was very active in Montgomery County, Councilwoman Reynolds Brown, when you think about trailblazers like our Augusta Clark and Marion Tasco, women like Colleen Alexander and Penny Gerber were laying the foundation in the suburbs so that women could have a seat at the table, Councilwoman Blackwell, relative to politics. And so a friend of mine just sent me this message saying that Penny Gerber was a special lady. She was tough and graceful, forceful and warm, and she never backed down. She was one of the first women to go through Chase's banking program in the 1960s when there were no women on Wall Street. She was the CEO of a Teamsters unionized transportation company, and in her final years was totally engaged in politics. And Mr. President, if you know Montgomery County politics, sometimes she, as the vice chair, appeared to wield more influence than even the male chairman. So special prayers sent to Mike Gerber and all of his family, and we will continue to remember the legacy of Miss Penny Gerber. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman.